asset, and we're going to document that contributing asset, well, okay, but maybe there's a better way. There's something more valuable than just focusing on that individual contributing, kick out individual, that less important contributing asset. Eric, you're on mute.
So I'm having trouble. I mean, I certainly get the concept, and I certainly get how you know, the construct is meant to sort of provide greater consideration than perhaps might be happening ordinarily. But what I'm having trouble with is, you know, the entire thing that undergirds this is, you know, the 106 process. And I'm trying to figure out if this actually will satisfy, you know, the key premise, which is, you know, the identification of historic properties. This is sort of like these constructs. I don't know whether they actually, they certainly could make for a useful agreement, but I don't know, and I would need ACHP's legal counsel to determine whether this really satisfies the intent on a technical basis, because we're not, we're basically agreeing to sort of not to identify historic properties, but not really, and to treat them in a different way, and to draw sort of arbitrary boundaries that are based upon sort of some agreed notions that I don't know how they would actually correlate to the proper identification of historic properties. You know, I'm having trouble with that. I always view historic properties as, you know, they either are or they aren't, and you can you know, sort of stop the process, but, you know, they're still eligible. So I would rather identify and then figure out, you know, some exceptions or some, you know, alternate procedures to address the fact that you cannot maintain a highly technical scientific operating facility in keeping with the Secretary's standards. It wouldn't be practical. And I think we recognize that. But sort of not calling it a historic property and you know, putting it in a different construct for the purposes of this, I'm having trouble getting my head around it.
Sure, I completely understand that, and you know, you're speaking to me directly here, Eric, because I have felt the same way. And some of what you all have seen in past drafts has been my attempt to make that link between a management approach and a formal technical foundation. And that is why in the last draft, what you saw is centers are gate-to-gate historic districts. That's what they are. That's another way to do it. And what I might say is, let's just say, and I'm totally going rogue here, let's just say NASA decided today that all of Johnson, this whole purple area, was a historic district, gate to gate. Would you not still be faced with the challenge of how to manage that effectively and how to carry out Section 106? What you might end up with is exactly what we're talking about. An agreement of some sort that says, all right, do whatever you want out here, except you got to document something if you're demolishing it and it's really cool. But we need you to, you know, pay more attention. We want to consult with you on stuff that goes on here. So that's really what we're trying to achieve here. And I admit that I am very, very anal retentive about a technical basis for determinations of eligibility. I believe very strongly in it. And so I would also like to resolve that. And that's part of why I think we want to open it up and tell you all, this is what we're trying to achieve. Maybe we're not there yet. You know, are there some other ways to do this that might work better? Chris.
So I think Eric's put his finger on some of the, so there's two things that I think need to be really parsed out. One is that gate to gate concept that you're talking about. And I think that in itself warrants an entire discussion. And I would agree with Eric that I'm not going to be in the place to kind of weigh in on that. I would definitely want Kelly Finizzo's input on that, our deputy OGC, before I weighed in on that point. But I do think the concept of the heritage zone, now that I've understood what it is, as a tool to help manage how 106 reviews are occurring on the centers, I don't have, as a concept, I don't have heartburn with that. That I see plenty of agreements that propose areas where there are prioritizations of, in this area, you know, a 106 review has to go here, and it cannot, you know, just go internally. It has to go out. That's, you know, I see that all the time. So I think that's, you know, helpful. And I think understanding how that's, making sure the PA is very clear about how that's going to be formed, you know, so that there's, you know, the right amount of input at the local level to make sure this is the right area. Because I know in Texas, they're going to have a very keen understanding about the zone and that space that they're going to want to see identified. Because I would agree with you, there are portions of Johnson that, yeah, you could pretty much, you know, do almost anything and it wouldn't affect that core area that I think is the, as you almost described, that cinematic space in that area. So from that perspective, I think I'm good. I think the discussion of the gate to gate and the way of recognizing that we're just going to treat it as all, I think that needs a whole like window of conversation. And I might want the right folks on my side to be in on one of those workshop calls just to make sure I'm giving you all the right input on it. I wasn't ready to discuss that one today.
That's quite all right. We're not either.
But yeah, go ahead. Sorry, Eric.
No, I was just say I like you. I'm comfortable with the idea of a zone that, you know, that gets extra special attention. And as long as you noted before, as long as there's been consultation on what that zone is, I agree. I just can't get past the sort of step one identification of historic properties piece. And I'm not sure the answer is just gate to gate either, because, you know, that answers the question now, but, you know, it may not answer the question 20 years from now. And I feel like if you did that, you would need to still have some sort of episodic conversation about, you know, the boundaries, you know, and about, you know, the contributing resources and you know, and I think that's what SHPOs were getting at in some of their comments. You know, that there should be some methodology to periodically review and help make those determinations so that they're not static and frozen in time.
Understood.
I think, and this is something that we're seeing, this is Chris Daniel again, from a lot of the other more recent developments in nationwide or large regional PAs, is that kind of what type of monitoring and, you know, tools are being used that are going to actually produce meaningful levels of oversight on these documents as they go forward. Because eventually many of us won't be here and other people will be carrying it forward. And, you know, we don't just want an annual report that comes out every year that kind of is almost, I don't want something meaningless coming out of it. I want, you know, if it's going to be some type of monitoring and it is going to, you know, episodically look at, you know, where these identification efforts, you know, are they successful? Are there more individually eligible properties being identified? You know, and that's part of this gets into the unknowns about NASA and the fact that NASA's mission is, at least currently in the media news, at a high lens focus right now of all the things going on with it, and probably likely is going to continue to be so, which means we're going to have more history happening. And so how does this agreement make sure it's not setting up a mindset that would let that future history be dismissed easily, but also isn't going to get in the way of allowing NASA's mission, which I think everyone is excited about, to continue too. That's the balancing, and I think that's the challenge that I know, Carrie, with what Rebecca's tasked you with, you're trying to solve here, is that unlike many other federal agencies that operate, facilities, many of them operate black boxes, and we just get told, "Oh, national defense, we're going to tear it down. We're going to go away. Don't look this way." NASA, on the other hand, is a super public entity because it's part of its own mission, and so there's this level of focus on it that I think the PA's got to have to be cognizant of as well, because each one of these facilities has their own group of retirees that watch them from the outside. I mean, I've interacted with them a few different times, so it's one of those how is that also keep managing that? And that just me just throwing an idea that now this conversation is making me think of is how is that thought of in the PA? And maybe it's not yet, and maybe that's something we need to suggest. I'm going to have to go back through and look to see if that thought is really captured there right now.
So what I'm going to do is just take the discussion forward a step. We've talked about the constructs of HTSF district and heritage zone, but what does that really boil down to in the APA? So hopefully you all have seen the consultation matrix, which is new to this draft. And is quite simple, but here you have the designated, the real property designated paths for assets at NASA: sustain, invest, outgrant, divest. Here you have the types of projects or undertakings that may be associated with those various paths. And what we are proposing in the draft is a certain approach for your HTSF districts outside of heritage zones, and then again, that greater level of consultation and scrutiny inside of heritage zones. So inside of heritage zones, you're consulting on renovation and modification, new construction, demolition, mothballing, abandonment, and asset transfer to a non-federal agency. NASA is prepared to do that. In exchange, NASA would like some flexibility outside of these areas. Flexibility to have a set path to mitigation for certain types of undertakings, specifically mothballing and abandonment and asset transfer to a non-federal entity. These are not demolition, but they are certainly, they certainly could ultimately lead to adverse effects to historic properties. So acknowledging that, NASA is offering to complete mitigation efforts on those assets and to continue to consult on demolition, because that's what it's all about, right? I mean, as a preservationist, that's once it's gone, it's gone. So the highest level of consideration should be given to demolition, whether it's inside or outside of the heritage zone. But in my opinion, consulting on demolition of a contributing resource, I'm not saying it doesn't have merit, and I'm talking outside of heritage zones, but I would rather see more attention giving to seeking alternatives and consulting on demolition of the best stuff. Those unique assets, those HTSF that NASA has that you don't see elsewhere. So the identification process that we will talk about in a future work session tries to get at that very thing. What's the unique stuff? What's the best of the best? What can't be duplicated outside of NASA? So what we have committed to doing in coming weeks is to explain in more detail what these various project types are. But for now, what we've offered is this: these are kind of the different thresholds of effects, if you will. And therefore, there's a slightly different consultation path that would be taken. So for NASA, this is the purpose of a heritage zone, to allow that flexibility, so that NASA can know well in advance, all right, this is what we're going to have to do to mitigate this or not. You know, if we are renovating an asset that's a contributing asset, we're not going to consult on that. We're just going to do it because we're continuing to keep that asset in use. It's continuing to contribute towards what's going on at the NASA centers. Now, if you're going to demolish something, different deal. We acknowledge that. Rebecca, did you want to add anything to that?
Just a couple small points. You know, so first of all, this is a slightly simplified version of the chart that's in the APA. So just want to clarify that there is a section in here for ground disturbance. So when these things say no review, you know, that does not preclude the process that would have to be followed if there is the potential to impact archaeological resources. So that was the first thing. And then the second thing was, you know, I don't want us to forget that. So Carrie gave the example of, you know, a renovation to a contributing element, which is certainly not the highest potential for us, you know, a really major adverse effect to a NASA historic property, but it is something that we would want to consider. And so even though in the process is calling for no review, no consultation on those types of projects outside of heritage zones, what we're actually proposing is to mitigate them as a batch with that programmatic mitigation. So I just don't want anyone to have this picture in their mind that we're just going to do whatever we want with contributing elements and not ever think about them again, that they are going to be documented through this digital map that we're proposing. And the intent of that is to capture things like the contributing elements, you know, which need to be understood within their greater context. So those are just the 2 points that I would offer.
Thank you, Rebecca. So the sort of general philosophy of the APA is to de-emphasize the contributing and emphasize the individually eligible. You guys have already pretty much heard me say that 3 or 4 times. So you'll see that, you know, as an undercurrent under a lot of these concepts. And so if you are, let's take an asset that is that's outside of a heritage zone. And I'm just going to pick it because everybody knows it, but let's just say Launchpad 39. It's the one we always go back to at Kennedy. Kennedy wouldn't be using this APA immediately, but just because we all know it, if Launchpad 39A is not in a heritage zone, which it probably wouldn't be, given that it's kind of out on the coast, an isolated asset, and it is going to be renovated or modified to accommodate a new program or new use, that is something that would not have a project-specific consultation under the APA. It will be considered an action that is part of modifying and upgrading and maintaining relevancy of NASA's assets and its centers. If it's going to be demolished, that will have a traditional framework of consultation. If it's going to be mothballed or abandoned, or it's going to be transferred to a non-federal entity, like say SpaceX, then that will be mitigated. That would be mitigated. NASA would acknowledge that recordation of that asset is appropriate. So that's how it's presented in the document now. Chris.
So a few questions. What if that transfer, I guess transfer means complete transfer, not a transfer that would include something like a Section 111 lease or potential provision?
Correct. It would be
Would
out
the
of
PA
NASA's ownership and control.
Would the PA help leverage those and saying those are opportunities that NASA could avail itself of prior to making that decision?
So there are two components of sort of 2 points at which the APA calls for focused consultation. There's the project specific period, which you all are familiar with. That's when you're usually engaged. But then there's the center planning piece. Now, NASA already should be and is in many cases consulting with SHPOs and consulting parties when they are developing and updating their center master plans. Sometimes that's not carried out as effectively as it might be. And that is the point at which you're early enough in the decision-making process that real alternatives can be considered. So that is where, Chris, and if we use the 39A example, when the center master plan is updated and that consultation with the SHPO and other consulting parties occurs, assets like that would presumably be discussed, because you don't just, NASA's not going to decide on a whim to do something like that. They're going to have a few years, advanced awareness of those assets that are going to be demolished or disposed of or divested of. And how many years, I can't really say, but quite a few. I mean, there's quite a bit of visibility there. So that is where those initial conversations would start to take place. And Rebecca, I'm going to ask you, because you work pretty closely with me on this component of the document. Am I capturing that appropriately?
Yes, I think that you are. Yeah, I don't have anything to add.
Okay. Because we all, sorry, Chris, please.
Oh, no, that's I'm just trying to think of ways to incentivize preservation opportunities. The other thing I'm thinking about is looking back to like the VA program comment that was developed regarding certain decommissioning of structures, is that one of the key things I think, and Eric, I would obviously lean more on you in this because obviously you've got your hands were much more involved in it than I was making sure that there was communication to relevant state historic preservation officers and other parties about upcoming activities at VA centers. And so I wonder how much we can help this PA continue that dialogue back and forth with the centers and their SHPOs. I know one of our staff who used to work for Virginia SHPO, Laura Lavernia, talked about how much the Virginia facilities really communicated on a regular basis and kind of maintaining those relationships about upcoming projects and activities, and kind of knowing where they would be tracking in something like if this PA was put into place and the facility did use it and it didn't already have an existing center PA, how much, information could we be sharing in advance to say, hey, we do have a slate of projects coming through. Most of them are going to be outside the heritage zones and they're going to be, requiring no review. However, these are going to be coming up that are inside the heritage zone. I think that kind of back and forth is another thing we might want to think about, because the last thing I want is for this PA to go into effect and then there'd be silence between facilities and SHPOs for much of the time. I think many NASA facilities that I work with across the country talk about how they actually have a really good working relationship with their SHPOs. So if anything, I want this to enhance that relationship, not, do radio silence. So I'm just again, brainstorming ideas that I'm going to have to write down myself for when we provide our comments on the current draft, but figured I'd put them out here too, since you're recording me.
Yeah, and Chris, I appreciate that perspective, and we certainly share it. It may come as no surprise to the folks on this call that sometimes cultural resources management interests are not as proactively integrated into asset planning by facilities planners as perhaps we would wish for them to be. So part of our goal with the APA is to address that and to require and reinforce the consultation process early enough in the decision making that alternatives can legitimately be explored, suggested and explored. So we have identified that center master planning effort as being the appropriate place to do that. And so, the way I think about it, I always try to imagine myself playing different roles, at the table. So, the center Johnson Center Master Plan is going to be updated. The consulting parties are invited to, come and consult on, all right, here's what we're thinking about. Here's our list of proposed sustain, invest, outgrant, divest assets. The CRMs will have already made master planners aware of the sensitivity of particular areas and assets. So that's the point at which NASA starts to get an idea of just how important these particular assets are and these project effects are to consulting parties. And they can integrate that consideration into how they think about the planning process. So maybe we don't need to get rid of that asset. Sounds like, the consulting parties are pretty keen on that asset. Well, okay, this one maybe we're not as concerned about. So I think it's that early distant warning of where consultation may be a significant factor in planning and executing a project for NASA. So, just looking at our agenda here, I did just want to follow up with just a brief sort of, we're going to come back to this visual during our mini consultations over the next few months, just so that we can all kind of have in our head the structure of the document. We are confident that we are presenting to you this time a much clearer document, a much clearer process. However, it's always helpful to have some visual guides. So specifically, heritage zones and HTSF districts are introduced in the recitals. And there are some very efficient, to the point clauses that address and present NASA's idea of these management constructs. And then in the stipulations, the heritage zone design guidelines, which we touched on earlier, are introduced in identification efforts. During project reviews, as we've noted, heritage zones have a different project review path. And then in standard treatment measures, heritage zones have their own path again for potential mitigation. So that's where you will see in the document the concepts of HTSF districts and heritage zones taking a major role in the the process. So Rebecca, I'm going to turn it over to you for, you know, any summary thoughts that you might have, and sort of take us forward to next steps.
Sure. So I want to thank everyone who has participated in this call. I think that we did lose Eric, but thank you everyone else for sticking it out, and I really appreciate everyone who has made comments, and I hope that you'll continue to do so. Already I think that we have identified in this conversation some areas of concern that we had not necessarily anticipated. So I think we will need to find the balance for the next few work sessions, you know, find the balance between defining topics for these meetings ahead of time so that people can decide if they want to participate, if that's a topic that they care about, and being a little bit flexible to work in room to address new topics that are arising, you know, in a timely fashion, because I don't want to lose the momentum that we have kind of already generated in this, you know, just this initial conversation. So I think the next immediate steps are going to be for me to get together with my team to develop a summary of the things that we talked about today, and to make some decisions about what our next meeting should address as a priority. I do see a hand. Chris, go ahead.
Oh, Rebecca, I just wanted to thank you and your team for the presentation, and emphasize that I want to encourage everyone who's participating today to please provide as much feedback as you can to NASA, as well as, you know, obviously, I know Eric's not here, but for those with the SHPO offices, you know how Nick Shippo and the ACHP, in the end, if this PA goes to signature, we are required to sign it, to execute it. So we want to make sure that everyone is informing NASA and giving them the most input possible, so that when a document does come forward for signature, and we can feel confident saying NASA, you know, really undertook an effort to consult and seek opinions on this, which I think calls like this are really exhibiting. So, but I want to just emphasize that to folks on the call. Please share your feedback. This is, you know, the team that Rebecca is working with is genuinely wanting to receive that, and the documents evolved significantly based on that.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. You know, I hope it goes without saying that we have no interest in sort of ramming anything down anyone's throats. And I think I have a very smart and creative team working on this, and I have the utmost faith in them. But there's obviously huge brain power in this room as well. And so, you know, if there's a better way of doing this, you know, than gate to gate HTSF districts, I want to hear them, right? I want to hear from what you guys have thought of. So please be forthright in your comments. We all have thick skins, and so we will not take it personally. That was all I wanted to say.
Yeah, and Rebecca, I want to underscore the importance of that. I mean, sometimes, you know, we can have sort of decide on an approach and maybe have blinders on about how a challenge can be addressed or resolved through this document. So I very much want to hear if you all have experience sort of addressing these challenges in a different way. You know, you've asked some good questions and raised some reasonable concerns. How might you suggest that we respond to those questions and concerns while still trying to meet NASA's goal, which at the end of the day is to continue to be a good steward of these amazing historic properties, even within its limitations. So I genuinely would like to hear what you think about that. We're not married to any particular approach in this document, but, you know, we walk that line of, we've got to give you enough to think about and sort of see how this might work in order to get your brains going about how, you know, some different ways to do it. Otherwise, it's just hard to imagine, you know, how to think about it. So we hope we've done that. So the next work session is proposed for the week of December 12th. Right now, we were proposing project types and consultation matrix. I'm wondering, and I want to know what the group thinks about front loading the gate-to-gate surveys and management categories discussion, since we have sort of crossed over into some of those areas, and Eric's not here, but I have a feeling he might be in favor of that. What do you guys think about moving that up to work session number 2? Chris gives a thumbs up. Anyone else? Beth likes it. All right. Rebecca, what do you think?
Yeah, I was thinking along the same lines. I think that's a good idea.
All right, great. Then that's what we'll do. And we'll just switch it with project types and consultation matrix. And then we'll just revisit what we think the next topic should be in every work session. Because there will be an organic progression to some degree. And there may be things that come up that we haven't proposed to focus on, but that you all would like for us to do so. Rebecca, anything else in terms of receiving comments? You know, you all have a blank comments matrix to provide written comments. Anything else that we should, any other information we need to give to the parties?
I don't think so. So the formal comments are due, we're asking for them by January 6th. But let me just reiterate, Chris, the next meeting, we haven't set a day for the next meeting. Sorry, I've interrupted myself. So let me finish my thought first. I wanted to reiterate that although we will want formal comments, we would really prefer to address the substantive comments that you're going to submit before January 6th, or, you know, as early as possible, because if this requires, you know, a radical new framework or rethinking of the way we structure this, then, you know, sooner is better than later. So please, you do not have to wait until formal comment period to submit your thoughts. You know, I would like to hear them beforehand.
Agreed.
As for the date of the next meet, so we have now the week of December 12th. Can I just have maybe a show of hands? Does this time, Thursday afternoons, seem to be sort of generally open for people? Okay. So, yeah, I think, right, understood. The week of, so that would be December 15th. We will work with Eric and Chris and see if we can nail down a time, and we'll get that sent out as soon as possible so that it is on everyone's calendars. I see a question here. How many work sessions are planned, and is there a list? So right now we have 1, 2, 3, 4 more. We were proposing for them to go through the week of January 24th, so 5 total. And we do have a list of the topics, and they would be bi-weekly, so just every other week. We do have a list of topics that are on today's agenda, but I think just based on today's discussion, that is going to have to be pretty flexible. So we'll try to get the topics out as soon as possible. You know, after each meeting, we will try to send out the topic for the next meeting as soon as we can, so that you all can plan whether you need to attend or not. And yes, we can also make the recordings available to view, and I can put them, let me think about where to put them. Possibly on the website, or maybe I will just send them out. But yes, for sure, we can make those available. Did I miss any questions in the chat?
I don't think so.
Okay.
And just a reminder that the agenda also has the preliminary suggested topics. But as I said, it's going to be organic. We want to talk about the areas of most concern to you.
Okay, so the next things that you're going to see from us are an invitation to the next bi-weekly work session for sometime the week of December 12th, with a proposed topic, and you should be receiving that. Hopefully we can get that out before the end of this week. What's today? Thursday? Yeah. So yeah, I want to thank everyone for attending and for sticking it out through the end. I think this has been incredibly valuable, and I hope that these will continue to be as productive. Carrie, anything in closing that you would like to add?
No, I'm